My name is Michelle, and I am the managing partner at Jigsaw at Work and one of the creators of the Jigsaw Discovery tool. And my big passion in life is human behaviour, and that was actually the driving force behind the development of the Jigsaw Discovery tool. So today we're going to be discussing those behavioural preferences and stress with particular reference to our new norm and the digital world. And I think I've just experienced plenty of that. So today we're actually going to be looking at, and I'm hoping that my screen is still being shared with you. If somebody can just give me a thumbs up to let me know that the screen, you can actually still see the slides. Yep, excellent, thank you very much. So today what we're going to be looking at is the relationship between stress and performance and awareness of behavioural based stressors. We're going to be looking at how we can recognise stress related changes in our behaviour, and then finishing off, concluding with ways in actually preference-based coping strategies. So once we have that understanding and awareness of our preference, then how we can actually tailor our coping strategies to better suit and better meet our behavioural needs. So just want to spend a few minutes thinking about the things which can be a source of stress for many, and top of my list is technology. But if we just think back, 12 months or so ago, some of the kind of things that we used to get when I was running stress courses and things, people used to say things such as finances, shopping, Christmas, school holidays, going away on holiday, going to network meetings, having that good old traditional speaking in public was also another great source of stress. However, as we know, life has dramatically changed for everyone this year, and now we've all got new worries and concerns. And that's, probably it is responsible for the rapid rise in the number of people feeling stressed and overwhelmed. And currently it's reported that about 79% of working adults in the UK are thought to be experiencing stress. If we just take a look at some of those stressors in the new norm, so we can see there things such as the uncertainty around the future, the spike in coronaviruses that are occurring. I heard yesterday on the news, there's about 100 different kind of spikes occurring every day, reportedly. Concerns about going back to work, going out to the office, wearing masks or not wearing masks. Job security, Zoom fatigue is another one of the stresses that are out there. So I'd just like to give you a question, just a moment to reflect on and ask you, how stressed are you? And I've just put up a poll. If you'd just like to take a few moments just to have a think about that and complete the poll, that would be great. Yeah, brilliant. So there, what we're actually seeing there is we have got 50, 80, well, 95% of people have felt either stressed occasionally, or 43% have felt stressed several times during the last week, or most of the time. So we can see that stress is really a big feature of our lives at the moment. So now, can you just type for me in the chat box, please? What's your biggest concerns in life at the moment, about life in the new norm? What's your biggest concern about life in the new norm at the moment? Yeah, uncertainty of future employment, going back to the daily commute, job security, second wave, other people being afraid, the virus, future, money running out. Yeah, elderly people, parents, managing other people's anxiety, uncertainty for business. Absolutely. In some of the recent research that we have done, regarding the things which are causing concerns and worry for people. I'll just share with you the next slide, and you'll see on there some of the actual concerns that people have said, things like, many of which you have already said: loss of jobs, returning to the workplace, long-term effects on families' health and the actual virus. But other things that have come out in there as well, not knowing what's going on with business, other things such as actually making remote working or working from home actually work effective, trying to manage those kind of boundaries between home and work. And one of the kind of interesting things that came out of there was with regards to our own abilities to manage our own levels of stress in the new norm, because we're aware and recognizing how much more stressed, or how more often we are feeling and experiencing stress. And the new norm of working in the digital world doesn't necessarily support our well-being. Working from home means for many people those blurred boundaries. We are working longer hours, stretching it out more, and there's a feeling and expectation that we're always going to be there to instantly answer those emails, or if somebody calls an impromptu Zoom meeting. Zoom fatigue is also an issue. It's as if we've kind of forgotten how to use the telephone, and now the easy answer is, let's have a Zoom meeting, let's have a Teams meeting. And that results in us having these back-to-back kind of meetings all week long, day in, day out. Another stressor that is affecting everyone is loss and grief. Now, very sadly, there are many, many people, far too many people, who have experienced some kind of personal loss. Family, close members have been lost to the virus. But all of us are grieving for the loss of our previous life, the loss of life as we know it. There's been a huge change with the way that we live, and we can no longer go to the theatre when we like, go to the cinema when we like. We have those huge restrictions on our weddings, on social events. Summer holidays are going to be very different. And everything that we knew about life that we had 6 months ago has changed. And one of the things we must not do is underestimate the impact of that loss that we've experienced upon our well-being and the impact that it has with our stress levels. We've spoken before about the actual effects of stress on our physical and mental health if left unmanaged. However, not all stress is bad. Good stress, sometimes referred to as eustress, is required to stimulate and motivate us to take action. By understanding our behavioural preferences, we can be aware of the situations and things which stimulate and motivate us, heightening our alertness and raising our performance until we reach the optimum level of alertness and achieve peak performance. Having knowledge of our preferred behaviours can energise us and means that we can manage the time that we actually spend in peak performance, in our zone of peak performance. However, if we start to receive too much stimulation, we begin to experience the effects of overwhelm and pressure and stress, or to give it its correct term, distress. If the stress is left unmanaged, or distress is left unmanaged, then it becomes what we refer to as chronic stress, which is when it can start to have those lasting effects upon our health and well-being. Again, having a knowledge of our behavioural preferences can help us to identify the situations which are most likely to overstimulate us or trigger stress for us as an individual. The key to managing stress is, first of all, it's all about understanding and recognising. Understanding and recognising your individual personal stress triggers. Recognising how you react under stress and being aware of the behavioural changes that take place, that occur with your behaviour when you are feeling stressed. And lastly, recognising those coping strategies that are based upon your behavioural preferences and developing those behavioural based coping strategies. For those of you who are not aware of the Jigsaw Discovery behavioural framework, I'll just take a few minutes to give you an overview of it. The Jigsaw Discovery tool has its roots in the work of Carl Jung and is underpinned by some of the latest developments in the field of neuroscience. What really differentiates the Jigsaw from so many other profiling tools is that there are no questionnaires. It is a fully immersive and engaging learner experience. There are no computer-generated reports. Instead, learners build their profiles, create their personal behavioural maps, and then develop and learn ways of applying the knowledge gained from that increased self-awareness and awareness of others, using it to build stronger relationships, increase collaboration, improve communication, reduce conflict, enhance customer experience, and raise team performance. Pre-COVID-19, the Jigsaw was delivered in a classroom environment using wooden jigsaws. Now, in the new norm, the Jigsaw has been digitised and it is delivered in a virtual learning experience. At the root of the Jigsaw are the three axes, as Carl Jung identified: introversion, extraversion, thinking and feeling, sensing and intuition. And if we just take a moment just to think about and look at those different axes. Our introversion, extraversion is all about where we get our energy from, where we focus our energy, why some people welcome more interaction with the outside world, and whilst others enjoy more time spent alone or in the company of a few people. Now, everyone spends some time extroverting and sometimes introverting. However, we all have a preference, a source of energy which feels more natural and less effortless, or more effortless and comfortable for us. Something that we call at Jigsaw our home base. Sensing and intuition looks at the kind of information that you prefer. Intuitive people tend to prefer to gather information using insights and associations, relationships, connection, recognizing the emergence of patterns. While sensing people pay more attention to information that's received through their five senses: sight, hear, taste, smell, touch. Thinking and feeling focuses on how we make our decisions. Thinking preferences like to make decisions based on logic and apply consistency, paying attention to the facts and remaining objective. Whilst feeling preferences consider what is in the best interest of people. They look at what is important for people involved and maybe have a more subjective approach to the situation. So if we take a closer look at these axes now in relation to how they inform us about our potential stressors, and we'll start that with the introversion and extraversion, and very much focusing on our current situation. So if we take the extrovert, being at home, some people have been through lockdown completely on their own, but equally being at home for long periods of time with just a few people, close family members, is equally as stressful for someone with an extrovert preference. Extroverts recharge their batteries from the external world, drawing from the energy of the external world. So being home for prolonged periods of time with limited excitement and stimulation can be very stressful. During lockdown period, when we're only able to leave home for very limited reasons and for very short periods of time, again, could have been a great source of stress for many. And this might seem a little strange to some for me to say, but my husband passed away last year, and in the strangest sort of way, I'm pleased that he was not alive to endure lockdown, because he had a very high preference for extroversion. And I honestly believe that it would have had some serious consequences on his mental health and well-being. Likewise, not having the spontaneous and frequent interactions with colleagues in the workplace, or feeling cut off from the colleagues and from the energy of the team or the business, not knowing what's going on because they're not in the workplace, could all be stressors for people with a high extroversion preference. If we think for a moment now about the people who have an introversion preference, then One of the things, and personally I'm an introvert, and one of the things that I find very stressful if I leave it unmanaged is the volume of Zoom meetings. Having all those back-to-back meetings is very stressful for me personally and for other introverts. It's not having that time in between one meeting and the next meeting. When we were back in the workplace, the majority of time we at least had even maybe 2, 3, 5 minutes break in between. We used to go and replenish our coffee cups, or we used to walk from one meeting room down to the next meeting room. But it was sufficient just to give us that little break, a time when we could go back and recharge our batteries. Focus inwardly and recharge the batteries. But just as a side word, the sudden explosion of online meetings is not just stressful for introverts. If they're left unmanaged, they can be draining for anyone, irrespective of their behavioural preference. Returning to the introvert and thinking about the distractions in the home, children being at home all day, needing help with homeschooling, noise from having other family members around, all meaning that it's very difficult to find that quiet space or time away to be able to just have those few minutes to yourself. Another source of stress for introverts can be a stereotypical assumption that because someone is an introvert, they won't be missing contact. They'll be quite happy being at home alone. So people don't make the effort to contact them, and then they start getting left out of the loop. And that starts to create even more stress and increases the feeling of isolation. It's worth pointing out and remembering that introversion and extroversion, just as the other two axes, are all continuums that we move up and down on that continuum. And there are times when extroverts enjoy a little bit of quiet time, just as there's times when introverts like to get out there, put themselves out into the world. If we now think about the sensing and intuition preferences, and again, the stress triggers, particularly in our current situation. For a sensing person, or a person with a sensing preference, they're likely to experience stress in situations where there's lack of clarity and certainty. They like detailed, clear, evidenced information. And thinking about the current situation, there is so much unknown and uncertainty. In many instances, we're almost making it up as we go, dipping our toe in the water, trialing ideas to see what works and what doesn't work. So it's easy to appreciate why the current situation we find ourselves in could be very stressful for people with high sensing preferences. Only this week, we've had the ongoing saga of face masks. Should they or should they not be made compulsory? Where is the clarity? Where is the certainty? Well, we've actually heard in the news this morning from the 24th of July, they are going to be compulsory in shops. All of the different social distancing guidelines in operation, depending where you live in the UK, they too can be confusing for everyone. But for sensing preferences, they can also be a great source of stress. One of the ideas often spoken about when we look at teams and working remotely is the need to have those unscheduled one-to-one check-ins, not to talk about business, not to check up on people, but just to touch base on that human level and have a personal kind of human-to-human conversation, the type that we would normally have in the workplace, just as a matter of course. And whilst, yes, it's a great idea to catch up with people, but we might need to put a little bit more thought and planning into how we can do this in such a way that won't be a stress trigger for people who are more sensing. People who have a higher preference for intuition. If we stop to think about all the information and the rules about returning to work, going back out into society, enjoying a meal, going to the seaside, there's absolutely no wonder that people with intuitive preferences have raised stress levels. Rules and high volumes of information and detail can feel a little bit like putting a straitjacket on a person with a preference for intuition. Some of the other stressors include colleagues or managers asking for certainty about the ideas they are putting forward, trying to avoid any form of risk whatsoever. Intuitive people like to gather information from patterns and connections, associations, and if communication channels are poor, they may struggle to gather the information and make those connections, leaving them feeling frustrated. Another potential source of stress for intuitive preferences in the current situation is that's due to the complexity of the pandemic and the effects upon society and the economy. People who have higher intuitive preferences, they like to see opportunities, they like to think about the future, to be able to see the future and have some confidence about what was going to happen in the future. So at the moment, with all the complexities, it's very, very difficult to predict with some confidence what is actually going to happen in the future. So again, causing further stress, frustration for people who have those higher levels of intuition. The last axes that we mentioned was our thinking and feeling axes. So people who have higher thinking preferences. Sources of stress for people with higher thinking preferences are likely to be those illogical decisions perhaps being made by government or employers regarding how the current situation is being managed. And again, only this morning, listening to the TV, when they were talking about the introduction, the compulsory, mandatory wearing of face masks. Some of the questions being asked, and in my mind, actually quite logical questions, were, well, how come if I go into my local shop and there's only a couple of people in there, I have to wear a face mask? But I can go down the road to a pub and there can be 50, 60, 100 people in there, but I don't have to wear a face mask. For some thinking preferences, that situation may be a very illogical situation, and again, a source of stress. The expectation of showing tolerance and understanding for colleagues who may be struggling or may have different behavioural preferences, being asked to speak about or listen to other people speaking about their feelings during a meeting, can be a source of stress. And this is actually a practice that I know an awful lot of people have actually started introducing as we've kind of been working more from home. At the beginning of a team meeting, perhaps, they go around the room asking people just to talk about, how are they feeling? And whilst for feeling people, that might seem quite comfortable, quite natural. But for somebody with a thinking preference, it could be quite a stressful experience. Just as those virtual social events that we organise, those virtual coffee breaks, those virtual team quizzes, for example, could all be sources of stress for a person with a virtual preference for thinking. Virtual and digital communication does come with its challenges for people with either feeling or thinking preferences. For people with a feeling preference, they like to have that human connection, the in-person relationship. They like to read the body language to give context to a communication. However, for a person with a thinking preference, they can find it quite stressful when other people just don't understand what they're saying. They don't understand the meaning of the communication. The thinking style of communication tends to be quite matter-of-fact, non-emotional and possibly quite direct at times, which can be open to misunderstanding, and again, a source of stress for the receiver. This is actually a good example of where having increased levels of self-awareness and understanding of others can help to reduce possible frustrations and stress. Because it is possible to give context to the messages by having that awareness and understanding of the communication preferences. I have a high thinking preference, and so my communication style is naturally quite direct and to the point. I'm aware of that, and therefore before sending a communication, I tend to stop and think about the receiver and how they may interpret my message, and then make any adjustments accordingly. But for my close colleagues who know my preference, if I send them a to-the-point communication, they know that the context of the message is that I'm probably short on time. I didn't mean anything by the directness. I didn't mean to offend or upset anybody. I didn't intentionally mean to be rude. It was just The context of the message was that I was short of time. Focusing for a moment on the feeling preferences, in general terms, the sources of stress come from a disrespect for their values, and conflict is another source of stress. Looking at the current situation where there is a very real and very large threat to the health and welfare of mankind, it's not difficult to understand why people with a feeling preference are experiencing those higher levels of stress. For several months now, whole nations of people have been in lockdown with very little freedom. People have been isolated, many people experiencing the loss that we spoke about earlier. For feeling preference people, the sudden loss of friendship, companionship, support from having their colleagues and friends is a source of stress. If a person is used to being in a team, knowing that they're not alone, and that if they need some help, they can easily just turn to a colleague and ask a colleague for some help. Suddenly being isolated at home and having to try to work everything out, juggling all those responsibilities, and amidst all of the worry and uncertainty, can be very stressful. Another important trigger for people with a feeling preference can be caused through their very nature of being true to themselves and putting other people first, leaving little time, if any at all, to take care of themselves, finding that quiet space to recharge, or going for some exercise, or simply just getting a good night's sleep is something that people of feeling preferences often neglect to do, because there is a tendency to put other people first. So I just want to ask you a quick question. What are you actually finding stressful in the current climate? Thinking about those kind of preferences you may have, what are the things that you are finding quite stressful, your stress triggers? If you just want to pop that in chat for me. Lack of communication, yeah. Uncertainty, lack of familiar patterns, isolation, the ongoing isolation, yeah. Not being able to get out and about. Being confined to the house while homeworking, homeschooling, absolutely. People who do not get it and how they communicate based on prejudice, absolutely, yeah. Not being brought in on discussions and projects, yeah, something that, you know, we need to think about when we are working remotely, and how we can actually ensure that everybody is kept in the loop and doesn't feel left out or isolated. Virtual meetings when need to look after your children, lack of communication from line manager, welfare, yeah. Not being able to go to church, cannot do that yet in my country, Nigeria, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah. So, moving to recognising our stress-related changes in behaviour. When our stress levels start to rise and we move from that eustress to distress, so good stress to bad stress, we start to prepare for the fight or flight, and our behaviour starts to change in readiness. Initially, we will experience, or we can see perhaps in other people, what we call the early warning signs, for example. So, bring pieces up for us. If we look at the intuitive thinking preference, people with the intuitive thinking preference will start to become demanding, impatient, perhaps even bearing on aggressive. And what starts to happen, those early warning signs, is they start to overplay. We all start to overplay or exaggerate our preference strengths. So somebody with a sense in feeling, one of their great strengths is that they are a little cautious. So they may overplay that cautiousness. People who are sensing thinking may start over questioning the situation. As our stress levels continue to rise, we can see further changes in behaviour. So for the intuitive thinking person, who is usually quite a decisive person, not very emotional, usually quite focused, they start to display the opposite behaviours and become perhaps emotional, breaking down in front of a colleague, something that they would never normally ever do. They find it more difficult to make decisions and may well defer a decision to a colleague. And the focus that they normally have for getting the result is less apparent. As you can see on this slide on screen, with the other behavioural preferences, the initial behavioural changes are an exaggeration of the preference strengths. But as our stress levels rise, they develop behaviours which are non-typical of the behavioural preference. One of the common misunderstandings I hear is when a person starts to tell me about a colleague, it could be their manager, it could just be a colleague, and say something, for example, such as, Fred is definitely a preference, has definitely got a preference for intuitive thinking. And then I usually ask why. And they start to tell me that Fred is very demanding and aggressive, doesn't listen to what we say. They often then go on to say, they never used to be like that. The reality of the situation very often turns out to be the fact that the person in question doesn't have an intuitive thinking preference. In actual fact, the total opposite. They could well have a sensing feeling preference, and they are just under a great deal of pressure. And what you are seeing is a stressed behaviour. So it's things we need to just be aware of, and having identified those behavioural preference-based stressors and the way that the behaviour changes as our stress levels rise, we just need to think about the people around us, our own behaviours. How does our behaviour change? Is it still at those early warning signs, or is it actually, has our stress level risen further? So I want to just move on and start to think about some of those coping strategies now. And one strategy which can work for all of us is to actually engage behaviours from other preferences. Preferences are what we would call in Jigsaw terms are lesser preferred preferences. Because by doing that, that can actually help to to stop the escalation of our stress levels. So for example, if we take our intuitive thinking person, I said earlier, under high levels of pressure, they find it quite hard to make decisions. They lose their focus. They perhaps start being a little bit more emotional around people. So they could well benefit by engaging some of their sensing thinking and sensing feeling behaviours, such as asking questions, gathering more information and detail, actually listening to people and talking to people. By doing those, they're engaging those sensing thinking and feeling preferences, which are kind of the opposing to their intuitive thinking preferences. Other things that colleagues could do, again, if they have this awareness of the behavioural preferences, they could perhaps offer ideas and suggestions up, provide some options for the person, for the intuitive person, offer their support and help. Don't wait to be asked, actually make that offer for help and support. So that's just one example how by understanding more about our own behavioural preference and having that awareness of the stressors in our life, the situations that do create stress, having that awareness of how our behaviour changes and being able to recognise it means that we can then start to take some action and think about some of the coping strategies we can employ. Just want to move on now and look at some of the other coping strategies. So if we start off with the intuitive thinking person again, some of the individual strategies they could perhaps employ would be talking to a trusted source, actually turning to somebody that they could really open up, perhaps for emotional support, accepting help and support from colleagues. Again, intuitive thinking people tend to be quite independent and often rebuff that help and support. Physical exercise is another good one, particularly for intuitive. I mean, it's good for everybody, of course, but for intuitive thinking people, it's a great way. Give yourself a bit of a challenge, but be careful not to make it too much of a stretch. Start with a reasonable, a reachable kind of challenge and go for that with some kind of physical exercise. Take time out just to refocus your energies. Again, often the intuitive thinking person can have tendencies for being a bit of a workaholic. So step back, take some time out just to regather, refocus your energies and confront the issue. Take control of the situation. Moving to our intuitive feeling preference people. There, my suggestions would be focus on hobbies. Take some time out for recreation. Do something that is fun, something that you enjoy. Perhaps think about joining a support group. Find a local group that can give you emotional support. Or you may prefer to just talk it through with someone who is not involved, someone who can actually offer you an objective opinion, some objective support. Take a break. Some time out, perhaps some social exercise would be something that I would perhaps recommend more for the intuitive feeling person. Something that you can kind of do alone, but yet in a social type environment. So perhaps doing the local park runs when and they set up again, or perhaps joining an outdoor gym class, which you can find in most local parks most mornings these days. And the last thing for the intuitive feeling person is actually around nurture. Nurturing yourself. And remember, it's not just about the physical nurture, it's also about nurturing your spiritual and emotional well-being. Our sensing thinking people. It's about, first of all, finding some kind of validation for the situation, that it is a stressful situation. Now, preferably, we should do that without asking for validation, but for actually finding factual information to support the idea that it is a stressful situation for you. Engage perhaps in a distracting activity. Do something that you can get totally drawn into and absorbed in, so that it actually takes you away from the things that are stressing, causing the stress. Ask for help. It probably doesn't come naturally, but do reach out to colleagues for help. Competence is something that is very important to sensing thinking people. So find a way of validating your confidence, giving yourself a little bit of a confidence boost. Look for concrete proof of your past achievements, for your competence, to help overcome those feelings of self-doubt. Disengage from the situation. Now, again, this may not come easy to some sensing thinking people. Just letting things go, because people with this type of preference actually tend to want to see things through no matter what, and they will stick at things to the very end. So actually just letting things go won't necessarily come naturally. But again, it's about looking to opposing behaviours. The sensing feeling person. Talk to a close friend, confide in them. Reflect on your personal values. Have you moved away from them? What do you need to do to get back on track? Focus on what is the right thing, the important thing about a situation, rather than focusing on the things that are wrong about a situation. Focus on things that you can take control of and do something about, and let the other things go. Do something that is fun, relaxing, just because you can. And the last one on there is to ask for some help. Sensing feeling people tend to give their help freely to other people. So now could be the time to start and ask for some help for yourself. Goes back to that self-care I was talking about. And again, using behaviours from different preferences. So the key to managing our stress we've talked through is understanding and recognizing what are your personal stress triggers. And understanding your behavioural preference actually gives you some pointers as to where your sources of stress may be coming from and why a particular situation is particularly stressful to you. So it's about really understanding the source of the stress underlying the situation that is on the surface that you are finding stressful. Knowing how you react to stress, being able to recognise those early warning signs, and then the escalation of our behaviour as our stress levels rise. And then developing the coping strategies based upon your behavioural preference, as we've spoken about today. In the webinar, we have only just started to scratch really on the surface of this. And I'm happy to answer any questions, and you can put them in chat, and I can email out the answers to everybody afterwards, circulate the information. If you'd like to find out more about our virtual Jigsaw Discovery experiences, you have our contact details, so please do get in touch. We are announcing shortly, hopefully later this week or beginning of next week, the dates of our next virtual experiences. So again, watch out for the dates being announced. And if there are any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box, and I will do my best to answer anything I can. Thank you. As MBTI, I use J&P. Any reason why these are not referred to? The J&P are not referred to quite simply because the Jigsaw is based on Carl Jung's original works, and the J&P in MBTI was actually added by Myers-Briggs later. It's not a feature of Carl Jung's original works. That's the reason why we don't actually use the J&P, and by doing that, it keeps the behavioural framework very, I'll say simplistic, but doesn't detract anything. It makes it very usable, very user kind of friendly. Would it be possible to send slides out to us? I can certainly look to do that. Yeah. Is this talk available online? Yes, the talk will be available online tomorrow. It should be available, and you'll get an actual follow-up email tomorrow with the link into it. I certainly will have edited some of it at the beginning, and please, I thank everybody for sticking with me. I sincerely apologise for the technology. I don't honestly know what went wrong this morning. It's been working fine when I was earlier on this morning on other calls and things like that. So I do sincerely apologise. Thank you, thank you for coping with the soundage. Melanie, thank you for doing that. And I'm very glad you found it was worth it. I just want to leave you with one slide simply because I'm an animal lover and I just found this picture, and do you know what? I know the quality is not very good, but I just love the slide. Be with those that bring out the best in you, not the stress in you. And on that note, I'd say thank you very much to everybody, and thank you for bearing with me.